let's talk about lumbar disc lesions. When to treat, when to co-manage, and when to refer. But before we do that, let's talk about what the lumbar nucleus looks like. I always wondered, and I couldn't talk one of my patients into giving up theirs, so we found a pig that was willing to give up his nucleus. And this is what a nucleus looks like. We can see that the inner portion is very viscous, very jelly-like. Now so one thing to remember is this is a young pig, that as time goes on, that starts to dehydrate and turn into jelly, which then turns into toothpaste and eventually turns into crab meat. I like to think of the nucleus, at least a healthy nucleus, like a bucket of water. That bucket of water is a good load-bearing and load transfer mechanism, and it has two great properties. Number one, it's non-compressible. You can put as much pressure as you want on that water column, and it's not going to compress. Now, the bucket may deform, being the annulus, but the water or the nucleus won't compress. And number two, it doesn't get tired and wear out. Over time, it can dry out, but it's not going to wear out. Now, as far as where that jelly goes, the nucleus typically herniates somewhere towards the 5 or 7 o'clock region, almost always at L4-5 or L5-S1. Remember, we've got that big, thick posterior longitudinal ligament that lives in the back of the vertebra at 6 o'clock, so usually it's going to pick one of the channels at 5 o'clock or 7 o'clock to come out. The other thing to recognize is that when it comes out, it's never been introduced to the vascular system or the immune system. When we look at this disc, you can see that just the periphery of it is vascularized. That's also the part that's innervated. So that inner portion of material, the nucleus, has never seen the immune system. And when it comes out, the immune system checks the guest list and says, I don't see you on the list, you gotta go. And it attacks it. And that attack is happening right next to the nerve root, so the nerve root gets irritated or compressed. Now, the difference between those two is huge. That if we have irritation, when that jelly comes out, the nucleus is herniated, the immune system is attacking it, it's happening right next to the nerve root, there's almost always a chemical radiculopathy, where the inflammatory reaction is causing irritation to those sensory fibers. And a chemical radiculopathy, which is most cases of lumbar radiculopathy or sciatica, is going to be pure sensory. When we start to see motor deficits or diminished reflexes, it means that there's more than an outside irritation. We're now getting to those inner fibers, the efferent fibers, and we're starting to see some compression. And that compression means somebody's being choked, which means somebody's going to die if that choking persists. I think of these two as though a chemical radiculopathy is like having a burn on your forearm that causes some discomfort to radiate down into your arm. Whereas a compressive radiculopathy is putting a tourniquet on your forearm that's going to cause a lack of blood supply, and there's going to be a long-term neurologic deficit. So our management needs to be very consistent with that. If somebody's having a chemical radiculopathy, we've got some time as long as they can manage the pain. If they're having a compressive or mechanical radiculopathy, there's not as much time, so that patient needs to move on to the MRI and potentially a consult with a spine surgeon as well, especially if we do find that there is a compressive neuropathy. A couple of clues to help us get there were discovered just in this last week. In fact, this article is not even published yet, at least not the time that I'm taping it. And this article said that chemical pain from lumbar disc herniations typically has these characteristics, that the pain is less than a 5 out of 10. It's worse after irritation or injury the next day. The patient usually has pretty limited flexion, 0 to 30 degrees, and they have signs of inflammation, meaning their symptoms are either constant, it's morning pain or stiffness that lasts longer than the typical morning pain and stiffness of arthritis. The short walking does not necessarily ease the symptoms, and the patient has some nighttime pain. Those are consistent with chemical type symptoms. And then our exam can help us as well. That this is a chart that we'll give you along with this blog, that most of us are familiar where are the sensory disturbances and where are the motor disturbances. The two things that I want to point out here is in our exam, it's crucial that we test for motor and reflex, because if a radiculopathy patient has a loss of motor or a loss of reflex, they are also having a compressive neuropathy. So that means something has to be taken care of quicker rather than later. So from a motor standpoint, one of the things that we do is we have the patient heel walk or toe walk. Don't do that for a single repetition, do that for 10 or 12 repetitions. And what we'll see is as the patient gets toward the end of that 10 or 12 toe raises or heel raises, that's when the deficit becomes apparent, once things start to fatigue. And number two, when it comes to reflex loss, don't forget the medial hamstring. Tapping on the medial hamstring can give us some good information about the L5 nerve root. I hope that this information about lumbar disc lesions has been helpful. I'd love to hear your comments about it. You can email me, Tim@ChiroUp, with any input that you have, and I'll look forward to talking to you again next time. Thanks for watching.